Welcome to my channel. This is the scariest short I've ever read from a subreddit. Horror. Every time I look away, the doll gets closer. I used to work nights in an old folks' home. One of my responsibilities was moving around the dementia patients every 2 hours or so to prevent bed sores. She had early onset dementia, and she kept trying to get out of bed and wander around. The nurses had told me to just keep her in bed for the rest of the night because they would be charting her and watching her more closely in the morning. So I tucked her in, turned off the lights, and went to move the next patient. This particular night I was working alone, which wasn't a big deal. As the nurse walked past me, I could see the look on her face go from confused to horrified in a split second. "Oh my God," she whispered. She wasn't in bed a minute ago. It just meant that I had to rush a bit to get all the turn and charts done in time before my shift ended. I felt a cold dread fill my stomach. We looked at each other for a moment longer. The night nurse gasped and stumbled backward. "Helen," she said softly, reaching out a hand. "It's okay. I just want to help you." Des. They checked her vitals, they changed her bedding, and they examined her for injuries. But when I reached for Helen's shoulder, she suddenly opened her eyes. They were blank and soulless, like two black pits staring back at me. All the while, she lay perfectly still, her eyes closed, a faint smile still playing on her lips. But before he could touch me, I slapped him across the face, and he turned back to Helen. He stared at me in disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snarled, taking a step toward me. I pointed to it, my voice trembling. "What is that?" And then, without saying a word, the night nurse got on the radio and called for assistance. Underneath Helen's gown was a porcelain doll, its head resting on the pillow beside Helen's. Its glassy eyes seemed to stare back at me accusingly, and the sight of it filled me with a sudden surge of terror. "Oh God," she breathed. "It's a doll." About halfway through my shift, I had moved one of the ladies back into her bed. Her name was Helen. They thought I was making it all up, that I was having some kind of psychotic break and imagining things. They're staring at the doll, their faces pale with fear. "How did you get here?" one of them whispered, reaching out a shaky hand to touch it. As I watched, its head began to turn, its gaze following my every move. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. And by the time we did, my supervisor had gotten there and paged the night nurse to come back. She jerked her hand away, her eyes wide with terror. "No, no, no," she whispered. "You don't understand. He wants me to hurt you." But the memory of the doll's accusing eyes and the feeling of dread that had filled me to the bone was just too vivid to be a figment of my imagination. As I walked up to my front door, I noticed a small package sitting on my welcome mat. I picked it up and saw that it was addressed to me. But when I turned it over, there was no return address. Then she slumped back against the pillow, her eyes rolling back into their sockets. It was the same handwriting that had been on Helena's chart. When I had found her out of bed, with trembling hands, I tore open the package. The doll was identical to the one I had seen in Helen's bed. I gasped and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. But how was that possible? How could someone have put a doll in my mailbox? We got her settled in bed again, and I sat there for a few moments, catching my breath and trying to calm myself down. That's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate dragging sound coming from Helen's room. I froze, listening intently. It stopped. I felt like something evil and malevolent was watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. Then I heard it again. I started to walk towards the sound, but it stopped again. There was no one there. I turned back to the doll, my gaze locked on its unblinking eyes. I kept standing there, listening for what seemed like forever, but it never started up again. They continued to stare at Helen, shaking their heads slowly. Was I crazy? Had I really seen a doll in Helen's bed? Was it all just a figment of my imagination? My shift had ended hours ago, but I had fallen asleep out of exhaustion, rubbed my eyes, and tried to shake off the lingering effects of my terrifying nightmare. So I shrugged it off and went to check on another patient. About 20 minutes later, I heard the dragging sound again. I spun around and ran to Helen's room. I threw open the door and started screaming for help. The supervisor had left by then, and I was starting to feel really bad because I knew that I was going to get in trouble for letting Helen out of bed. I figured that since the nurse had been right outside the room and didn't hear anything, she would understand why I hadn't called sooner. And there she was, sitting up in bed, staring straight ahead at the wall with a big smile on her face. It took 4 of us to get her back down into her bed. The night nurse came running. Apparently, she had been charting in the hall outside Helen's room and didn't hear any of this. But instead, she chewed me out for not calling for help right away and for not keeping an eye on my patients. And then she went to check on Helen. We both looked back at Helen, who was now lying flat in her bed with her eyes closed. Before I knew it, there were at least 6 people crowded around Helen's bed, talking in hushed voices. Finally, the night nurse turned to me. "Get her up and let's take her to the bathroom. She needs to be cleaned up and changed." "Get away from me," she rasped, her voice a dry, brittle whisper. But Helen only shook her head violently, her eyes never leaving mine. The doctors and nurses exchanged uneasy glances. None of them said a word, but I could tell by their body language that they were all thinking the same thing. I tried to tell them that I wasn't, that Helen had spoken, but I didn't know if they'd even heard me. "Come on, let's get her to the bathroom," one of the orderlies said, reaching for me. "Stay away from me," I whispered, backing away. "She's not safe." "Oh, for Christ's sake," the orderly said, rolling his eyes. "Let's just get this over with." That's when I noticed it. Something small and hard protruding from under her thin hospital gown. One of the nurses leaned closer, and her eyes widened. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the doll. "Get away from me," I cried, scrambling to my feet. "Get it away from me." But the nurses weren't paying any attention to me. As soon as she did, the doll's head snapped toward her, its mouth opening wide in what looked like a silent scream. "Don't touch it," I warned, my voice hoarse with fear. "You have to get away from here." But the nurses weren't listening. They continued to stare at the doll, their faces pale with fear. "Get away from me," I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. "Get it away from me."
Ow.
But my warning went unheard. The nurses continued to stare at the doll, their faces pale with fear. "Get away from me," I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. "Get it away from me." Woke up in my car in the employee parking lot. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events of the previous night in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream. I pulled into my driveway and got out of my car. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the handwriting on the package. Inside was a porcelain doll, its glassy eyes staring back at me accusingly. As I stared at the doll, a sense of foreboding washed over me. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when it happened. The doll's head turned slightly, as if acknowledging my presence. "I need your help,"